This is related to that Fisher plan also, 100% reserve. Okay, banks don't lend, they're absolutely safe. But then what about credit and growth and development and so on? So I think the answer is, again, different kinds of regulatory design, improved ex-ante incentives that reduce leverage caps, without totally killing the ability to create credit and fund growth and industry and innovation and development. So I think to answer the question about the capability of the G20, again, there's too much the BIS and there's too much absence of learning from diversity, experiences of other countries, what had worked, rather than the standard. After all, BIS and bankers have to be conservative, but then in new situations you have to think differently. So there was a lack of innovative thinking or learning, and we are making those mistakes and seeing all this arbitrage happening. It could have been predicted. There were recommendations in the literature. People were talking about imposing haircut and on transactions rather than buffers, but it was not adopted. I've heard that that the BIS or G20 is dominated by bureaucrats rather than academics. Academics are required, are bankers. So.
Yeah, my worry is that in a crisis, really the only balance sheet really available is that of the sovereign. And if you put in things which say that the sovereign balance sheet cannot be used, which is basically what Dodd-Frank was trying to do. Yes, we put taxpayers' money at risk. We don't want that to happen again, right? Which is what Europe is trying to do via its state aid norms, that the national balance sheet cannot be put to use. Then what you end up with is that you are reliant entirely on the bail-in mechanism. The only way to resolve is to push losses onto somewhere in the existing balance sheet. You push losses onto the shareholders and then to junior creditors and go up the line. Now, the difficulty with that approach is that it can work when only one bank is in trouble, but in a crisis, what you're doing is that you're going to create more contagion from that. Because as you inflict losses on some set of people, those guys' balance sheets are going to get impaired. And then you would need to bail them out. Then you're going to bail in their creditors. And you would have exactly the classic contagion problem happening, that you started with two banks which were sick. So you bailed in their creditors. So those guys became sick. Then you bailed in their creditors. And before you know what happened, half of your financial system is sick. And you do not have the standby balance sheet of the sovereign to actually step in, clean it up. I think the mistake that governments made in 2008, particularly in the US, it didn't happen in the UK, in the US was for ideological reasons, they refused to nationalize the banks which had failed, right? If they had nationalized, let's say, Bankam and Citi, and then reprivatized them, then the backlash against using the public balance sheet might have been less. And from whatever little, I mean, you would know better, I think the backlash against government money is probably least in the UK compared to either Europe or US. And that's because there you could clearly see that, yes, these guys paid a price, they were thrown out, they were nationalized, and the state just took action. Here, it looks as if the state bailed out the existing shareholders and so on. But when you adopt rules based on that basis, you are asking the state to say, you got to resolve these, but you got to resolve it with one hand tied behind your back. The sovereign balance sheet, which is the only thing which is really available, can't be used, and that is the danger which I see in this process.
Amarji, do you want to add anything? You don't have to, if you want to.
Maybe on that G20 question, evaluation of whether the reforms have helped or not. I'll just try to address that. See, in my opinion, we had GFC in 8-9, and then you had benchmarks crisis, which was very huge again, where LIBOR and all the interest rates were getting manipulated. But that crisis, if you look at the nature of the crisis, it came from a different source. It raised whole lot of conduct and culture which is there in the financial firms, in the big financial firms, it rose, it gave rise to those issues. And you have, as a result, in UK, you had this Fair and Effective Market Review, FEMR, which is focusing entirely on the conduct piece. And they brought in a lot of, very specific, granular kind of regulations for regulating the conduct of market professionals. So the point is, and this is the general statement which I'm making, the next crisis comes from a different source. And the previous reforms don't help you much. So, but I'm hopeful, in terms of what FSB is trying to do, we have some interaction with Financial Stability Board. They are trying to get on the table some proactive agenda. In terms of the risks which are building up, like let's say cyber threats, or the fintech, it has both, it can have destabilizing effects also, and it has a lot of benefits as well. And the key is, to my mind, if the regulators have formal processes to scan the external environment and to see where the risks are building. Because if you have informal, just some committees which meet once in 6 months, talk about some agenda, and then they meet next time, it doesn't work. So you need to have regular departments within the regulatory system which look at systemic risk on a continuous basis and try and identify new indicators. It's a very, very dynamic field, and it's always a moving target. So you can't just stay with the tools that you have and keep exercising those tools all over again and again. It doesn't really help much. Thank you.
Professor Verma, I take your point about the sovereign's balance sheet not being used or being kept out of bounds can be a problem. But on the other hand, the average person says, these guys, these bankers, heads I win, tails you lose. That you doesn't matter who it is. If it's the sovereign, ultimately it's taxpayer. I remember talking to senior people from RBS and Lloyds Bank. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think they're still majority government-owned. And there was a hue and cry when there was some talk about bonuses. You could see the public anger as seen through letters to editors of newspapers and also some edits and so on. So it's a difficult situation. I take your point, but these are difficult issues as to how do you allow institutions which can collect deposits actually use them, whether it is the leverage ratios to be controlled or whether it's the sovereign is always the backstop and so on. I noticed that we are out of time. It's already 2 minutes past 5. My good friend Rajiv Lal is sitting right there. He's the chair of the next session. So I cannot take the chance of losing his friendship. So I will stop now and thank all of you for participating so actively in this session.